Letters to Lisa. Recording 5. Compilation 3. The Tunnel. Here's rather a long letter that the young people found in the attic. Thankfully, a lot of my items were up there, along with some expensive jewellery I've gifted them. Well, I felt bad occupying their home without paying my way, even though was my house. Anyway, here is the letter I've just named Tunnel. Lisa, when I was young we had this game, you see. Well, it was more of a belief, a sort of theory that myself and 3 of my close comrades had. My village was nothing to look at, really, a grey, empty, dull husk of a town, more than a place for memories of youth. It was so boring that the most exciting part of it was the railway that took you out of it. Located some way from the rest of the hovels that littered the grey hills, it was a wee little thing with 2 platforms, an office and a shelter. The truly intriguing aspect of the railway, however, was the fact that the train would have to go through a rather long Victorian tunnel under the hills. The dark, extending, dangerous void fascinated us youngsters. The fact that it seemed to go on forever, but you could get immediately run over by the 4:15 from Chester if you set foot on it for even a second. It gave us all one hell of a buzz. In retrospect, the tunnel isn't really that long. It probably just seemed more intense to us as kids because everything always seems bigger and more mysterious as a child. 4 of us, Charlie, Mike, Stella, Brian and me, would play this game after school or during sports if we could bunk off. We had this game, you see. We'd taunt and bully each other into playing it. There used to be this old man. We didn't know if he was homeless or had some sort of mental illness, but he used to stand on the side of the road up to the railway. He'd always be there, not just after school, but every time you passed the road. He'd stand there smoking cigarettes. He wore a coat, but didn't even seem to be affected by weather. Rain, sleet, snow, he'd be there, slowly suffocate on his own packet of rollies. The game was simple. You had to keep him talking just long enough for one of the others to pick his pocket and take his next box of straights. We'd have been around 12, 13 max when we did this, and thought it was the funniest thing in the world. He'd always seemed surprised that his box was missing. He'd somehow found a spare fag on him in an uninspected pocket. One ridiculously bitter autumn afternoon, when the weather should have been nice, when the weather was nice in every other part of the country, we'd bunked sports. No point running around in tight, tiny shorts when the wind was whipping the goalposts back and forth. We'd planned to play the ciggy game, then split the packet on the walk home. The old man stood exactly where he was meant to be. Stella, my sister, was the one with the gift of the gab, so we let her do the talking. Charlie was the weediest of the group, and Stella's boyfriend was the designated pickpocket. He was so sweet, was our Charlie, but was no artful dodger. We were trying to train him up, really. This meant Stella would have to keep old Sig yapping for some considerable time. She walked up to old Sig's, bold as brass, and said, "Sorry, love, you wouldn't know when the next train is." He looked at her with his glassy red eye and just said, "You're a few hours early to this spot, young lady." He always said cryptic stuff, did old Sigs, but it almost added to the thrill of the game. If you could pretend he hadn't faced you. "Oh, you couldn't spare us a ciggy, could you?" she said, cool as anything. We all giggled. Charlie was making his careful way round the back of old Siggs, tripping over himself in the process. "Your friend isn't going to get his train for a very long time," he said, almost smiling. "Oh, really?" Stella was laying on her charm. Charlie was so close to the man, his hand practically on his coat. A very long time," Siggs repeated, suddenly losing the smile. "Oh, why's that?" Stella nodded to Charlie to speed up his job. Mike, Brian and myself watched, biting our tongues to stop from laughing, and looking away every so often, trying to look inconspicuous. Old Siggs turned to us and gestured, "They'd better hear this. It concerns you all." Stella had smiled and waved at us. Mike had panicked. He was quite freaked by old Siggs, but we dragged him over. The old man had smiled at us and turned to Charlie, whose hand was still in his coat pocket, red-handed. Siggs didn't seem to mind. He simply moved Charlie's hand to another pocket and turned to address us.
You know tunnel, the one the train passes through?
We all nodded, rather confused, but all interested to see where this was going. He took a puff from his fag.
If you pass through the structure whilst whistling, she'll be coming round the mountain. You will never catch that train. It will always miss you.
He stood back smiling, as though he'd imparted wisdom wiser than all of our years combined. Charlie had finally managed to wriggle his hand out of the man's stinky grey overcoat and was stuffing the cigarette packet in his gym bag. "Well, that is interesting, isn't it, gang?" Brian said to us, trying to make things less awkward. We all grumbled agreements and began shuffling off.
Believe me, it will change you. It will make life very interesting indeed.
He shouted at us as we walked off. We noticed him stub out his butt and produce another one from his shirt pocket, lighting it with a match from behind his ear. We walked off round the corner before sprinting to the bus stop. There we stopped to open our prize. Charlie was so excited. He'd never managed to do it before, so we congratulated him despite the fact that he'd been caught. He opened the box before his face fell. It was empty. "Oh, bloody hell, Charlie, you had one job to do. How did you mess this up?" Mike said. He'd been craving a straight since maths. I took the packet and noticed a small note. "Return to the tunnel by 12. "Do you think old Six is picking up drugs there?" Brian asked excitedly. "Probably why I keep going on about bloody tunnel," Mike said, standing offish. He wanted to get back home and be done with this. "Maybe we should check it out. Might be a laugh," Stella said, cackling. She was always one for pushing us to do something more dangerous. We shouldn't have gone to the train tracks. I mean, it's just a bad idea in general, wherever you live. However, very little would be going on, and we were desperate for summer. Anything that would bring some excitement into our little town life. The station was empty, as usual, and the train had just left for Leeds. There wouldn't be another for an hour. We staggered uphill and stood on the tracks, getting our breath back. Mike was fret, but didn't want to look chicken. Stella pushed him into the tunnel, with Brian to look out for any bags or boxes Sig could have hidden drugs in. The lads were in there for some time. Charlie and I kicked an old cola can about, as Stella mocked us. Then Mike emerged, looking terrified. He ran up to Stella and grabbed her by arm, almost stacking her in the process. He was panting for breath. She swatted him off as he told us that he'd lost Brian. He'd just vanished, and there was something after him, something big and unkind. Suddenly, Mike ran out, rugby tackling me, and leaving Charlie, Brian and Stella laughing. They hadn't found anything. We were all thinking of giving up and cracking off home. Stella wasn't having any of it. She insisted that there must be something in there. If not drugs, something, maybe a weapon or money even. None of the rest of us were up for it. As she didn't care, she strutted out in front of us and gave a tip of an invisible top hat. "Ladies," she gestured to us before skipping towards the tunnel. As she skipped, she began to whistle. I recognised tune. It was upbeat and simple. Boy Scouts song, or maybe she picked it up at Brownie's. As she skipped, the sound became echoey and distant. Bits of it disappeared into the soft, soundproofing red brick. As we stopped there, we all could hear the faint sound of the song. Its repetitive chorus began to stutter out till there was no music left at all. We all stood there, holding our breath. Mike checked his watch. 3:15. 45 minutes till the next train. We stood there staring and listening as hard as we could. We joked that the old man could have been right, that maybe it was a portal to an afterlife, and Stella was grabbing the express route to hell early, as we all knew that's where she'd be ending up. Perhaps old Sig had planted the note to lure us here, and the old perv had kidnapped her just because he was a nonce, but not a gay nonce. As the situations we'd invented became more ridiculous, our chatter died down as time went on. Stella still wasn't back. Brian sat down. Charlie began to rock back and forth. He was clearly worried for her. I was starting to get fidgety myself. Mike told us that it was 4:10, 10 minutes till next train. The tunnel was long, but not long enough. She wouldn't have come back by now. We stared intensely at the darkness until out of nowhere the whistling started again. It was loud. There was a sudden sharp wolf whilst we whipped round to see Stella stood behind us. She was all smiles and giggles. Charlie grabbed her and dragged her from the train tracks. We all started off back up towards the village. Stella seemed none the wiser that she'd given us all a scare. As soon as we were past old Sig's, Mike turned to her and laid into her. He berated her for leaving it so late, that a train could have hit her, not only her, but all of us. She laughed at him. Oh, honestly, Mike, it were only 5 minutes, she chuckled. Only 5 minutes? We chorused back at her. Mike thrust his watch in her face. It's 4:05, Stella. You were gone at least half an hour, she grunted. Oh, don't try that one on me. You just moved hands forward. You won't get me like that. As she giggled uncontrollably, there was this recognisable sound of the National Rail's worst chugging its way into the station. 5 minutes late. Stella seemed shocked. It affected her so much, her smile slipped and she began to chew a thumbnail. What happened in Tunnel, Stella? I asked calmly. She looked at all of us, as if she was taking this in for a moment. Nothing. I just walked through. I didn't even really stop to find anything. It was too cold for me. She was clearly embarrassed to have sort of chickened out. I just walked through, and then the end sort of stopped down the track behind you guys, like it looped round. Honestly, it only took 5 minutes max. She was starting to understand our fear. We all broke off for home. Our mother in particular was confused to find us home so early, as we were usually still messing about in town at this point. We had our tea and got ready for bed. Stella never spoke to me. She didn't seem that upset about it all. I'd just brushed my teeth and was getting ready to listen to a cassette of Hancock on my Walkman, under covers, when she knocked on the door. She sneaked in and, seeing me awake, smiled. This usually meant she was up to summat, so not a sign I was happy to see. Hey, you don't think all 6 was right? She said, sitting on edge of bed. A clear sign this wasn't going to be a quick conversation. What do you mean? I said, rubbing my bleary eyes. He said, if you whistled, you'd miss the train. It didn't hit me. It's some sort of time teleporting thing. I stared at her, hoping this was a strange dream. I whistled the song he said to whistle, and it worked, she said, bouncing up and down and making my pillows fall off the bed. Stella, you just got lost. You didn't realise how long you were gone, is all. I dismissed her, hoping to get back to Sid's latest scam and Kenneth Williams' camp characters learning to count. No, I didn't. There's no way I was away for such a long time. I was whistling. What was it? Oh, God, I've forgotten it now. She seemed to ignore my points entirely. She'd be coming round the mountain, I offered, hoping this would speed things up. She jumped from my bed excitedly and stated, That's it! It worked! I can't believe it worked! We've got to try this again. No, I responded, almost wishing she had been hit by the train. I'll tell the others tomorrow. We'll meet there and test it out, she said as she skipped to the door. What about trains? I shouted after her. If we try on Sunday, it's only one train every 2 hours. That should be enough time. She was clearly satisfied with risking it to prove herself right. That Sunday, we were off to the station after a particularly dreary sermon from the local vicar about the innocence of youth and the sinfulness of television, specifically the anti-Bible rhetoric of Douglas Adams and his pirate planet. Clearly our reverend wasn't the biggest fan of the latest Doctor Who adventure. I tried to talk to Mike and Brian about it, but they were all hyped about Stella's supposed discovery. Charlie wasn't keen, to be fair. I think it was only Stella that was really keen. However, we wanted to see her fail. It would make for a funny joke to keep reminding her that the time she thought she could time travel, worth a Sunday morning in the light autumn rain. She hadn't let us get changed out of our Sunday best, so we were all suited and booted, her in a white and black dress. Her best dress. Brian was panicking that he'd slip and get mud on his suit. He'd be in for it if he did. We didn't want to push him into it. His old man was a hard bloke and wouldn't have taken kindly to anything out of place in his home. I'd wish we'd made him go home. I think about it a lot now. I think we all do. Stella had broken into a sprint at the sight of the tunnel. Mike grabbed her, stopping the 11:30 from Leeds from tearing her apart. It was 10 minutes late. She smiled nervously. Well, we know there won't be another one for an hour. She smiled as though nothing had happened. For the youngest of the group, she had a way of controlling us. Stella, maybe this wasn't the best idea, Brian simpered, carefully stepping onto the tracks. Oh, shut up, Brian. You lads are such girls, she giggled, trying to take jibes of our masculinity. Can you say something to her? Charlie asked me, exhausted. I shrugged. I wanted to get back to the Open University, mostly to laugh at the ridiculous-looking presenters praying there might be a nice bit of skirt on. Stella sprinted off down the tracks, nearly falling face first over a rotten plank. She waved at us, flicking the V's before disappearing into the tunnel. She whistled as she did. We stood there waiting, hoping the rain wouldn't get heavier. Moments later, she returned, frowning, still whistling. That's William Tell! I shouted at her. "You what?" she shouted back between notes. "You're meant to be singing 'She'll be coming round the mountain,' you wally," Mike shouted over to her. She stopped, scowled for a second before giving us the thumbs up, smiling and rushing off again, the American soul folk song bouncing off the brick and echoing towards us. Mike kept checking his watch. Maybe someone should go in after her," Charlie suggested. He was hopping from foot to foot. He dashed in nervously, whistling as though hoping for a call and response from her. There was a tapping sound. Mike checked his watch. We stared at the tunnel, worried we'd miscalculated the schedule. Stella thumped Brian and Mike on the back. "All right, puss," she cackled. "How did you get round so quickly?" Brian screeched at her. "I took my time this time. So what time is it currently? Or maybe we should have checked. Oh, bollocks." She stamped her foot, now having a tantrum. "Charlie went in," Mike said blandly. Stella looked surprised. "Right behind you," Brian continued. Stella ran up the track again. "I can't find the exit. It was somewhere here." She ran back, passing us and into the tunnel, her footsteps echoing, wavering loud, then quieter before returning. She appeared. "He's not there. Cleared the old tunnel. Did he whistle?" She seemed stressed. "Yeah, the same as you," I said, bored now and hoping to get changed out of my starchy attire. I should have been more in the moment. Charlie didn't return from the tunnel. We searched for him everywhere. By the time the train arrived 2 hours later, we left, hoping he'd sneaked off home without telling us, to spook us. He hadn't, and by the third day he was missing, so we started freaking out. Brian confessed to Vicar, who immediately told our parents. We were banned from the station and couldn't even see my aunt go off when she left for a new job in Glasgow. Charlie was just gone. Adults had been through the station and tunnel several times. They didn't think he'd been hit by a train, as there were no remaining signs of his body. The most disturbing aspect was that the old Sigs was missing. Mike said he'd seen him in hospital in the waiting area when he'd gone to see his grandma, but we weren't sure. There was an agreement amongst the adults that old Sigs had kidnapped him for nefarious means. We never believed this. Sigs had never shown any signs of being a perv. He seemed almost a positive parental figure, despite the smoking and strange phrases. It had been strangely quiet. Stella had stopped giggling so much. She'd matured, but had become very quiet. I heard her crying a few nights. I thought of going in and helping her, but she only glared at me. After 3 months, life had gone back to a sort of duller version somehow, more dreary than before, like we were just going through the motions. One rather dull afternoon, the girls were playing hockey, and we were stuck rugbying when Mrs. Saunders from Maths ran onto the field, her heels caking in mud. Mike and Brian were trying to display who had the best Northern Soul moves, and I was smoking rather obviously and spotted the young maths teacher first. She was top totty, as Mike's dad would have said, with a scowl that made you want to cause trouble in class. She almost knocked Mr. Richardson over in her speed. The two teachers had a rather intense conversation, a lot of hand-waving and shocked expressions. Mr. Richardson pointed towards us at the far end of the field, where we pretended to be keeping goal despite us not playing football. I threw the straight down and whacked Mike over the head to get the others' attention. Mrs. Saunders walked over to us, trying to recompose herself. "Boys, will you come with me, please? They found Charlie." We all stood stock still. She began strutting off again, and we quickly got up and followed her. "No fucking way!" came Stella's shrill voice from the hockey court. As we passed, she rushed up to us. Charlie was sitting in the headmaster's office, looking rather confused, still in his Sunday suit. He smiled at us, rather relieved not to see other kids. His parents were holding on to him like he might fall apart without support. "Charlie!" we chorused. "Charlie wanted to see you lot before his parents took him home," Mrs. Saunders said, matter-of-factly, hiding how surprisingly happy she was. "Where have you been, Charlie, my little man?" Charlie's mother said, clawing at him. Even his father seemed overjoyed to see him, still in his work overalls. "I mean, when I came out of the tunnel, you guys had scarpered. I don't understand you. You just sped off." Charlie laughed. "It's been 3 months, Charlie," Stella said, hugging him tightly, covering his suit in mud from hockey. His mother didn't even stop her. Charlie left with his parents, still unaware of the time he'd lost. We all were pushed off back outside to sports. After a year or so, we sort of just forgot about it all. Eventually, Stella and Charlie got engaged, and Brian was getting an apprenticeship at the factory. Mike was putting in his application for Oxford. Time had seemed to sped up. After a drunken picnic to celebrate the end of school, we'd gone to see Mike off for his Oxford University interview. The station was empty, and we were incredibly early. Brian and Mike had been placing bets all day, trying to outman each other in an almost homoerotic rivalry way. Brian was balancing a little red shot glass on his head, and Mike cartwheeled onto the platform. Stella slipped onto the tracks, and in the way she always did, looked at the tunnel and gave us a daring smile. "What happened to you, Charlie?" Brian said out of nowhere. Who knows? Maybe 6 was right," he mumbled, watching Stella tripping over the tracks. She began to whistle. We all stopped when she did. "No!" I yelled. "Okay, I'll do it. Magic isn't real," Mike yelled drunkenly. He wobbled into the tunnel, whistling on and off. Brian tried to grab him, but failed. 20 to 4, Mike disappeared into the darkness. There was the sound of shouting from somewhere, but the drunken fog was all upon us. Brian wobbled after Mike, also whistled somehow in an aggressive manner, as if to stop or slow Mike. Charlie hung on to me as Stella did an impromptu dance to the whistling, twirling rather lazily. We watched the others disappear as my heart took the lift down sharply. A part of me worried that we'd never see each other again. The shouting that had been blurry and far off was closer and recognisable. Mike appeared out of nowhere at top speed almost seconds after we saw him disappear into the tunnel. We span round. "I was shouting to you wankers. Why didn't you stop him?" Mike seemed more sober and upset. Stella was so confused she began to throw up in a small ditch. Maybe the several shots in the local had been bad idea, especially on top of the homebrew vodka. "Where is Brian?" Mike was shouting. He ran back through the tunnel this time, not looping round. Is this what happened to me?" Charlie burped. "Yeah," I said slowly. "This was a bad idea," Stella said through hiccups. She had exhausted herself and sat to the side looking miserable. We waited. 10 to 5. Brian was just gone. Mike caught his train. We hoped it would be 3 months again. A strange sort of time jump. We sort of thought it might be good because then he wouldn't waste his money over the summer and he wouldn't have felt lonely. He could just stay safe and not age. However, it wasn't 3 months. It wasn't even 3 years. His parents hoped he'd just run off for a sort of cheap gap year in Blackpool with his ex. We never told people what happened. It was eventually assumed that he died on a moor somewhere. We knew, only us. Charlie and Stella are married, 3 kids, all nuts. Stella doesn't care. She's very happy. Mike is a doctor, practising in London, the jammy sod. We meet up every year or so now. Last week, in fact. Mike was on the same train as me, in first class, however. I spotted him, and he sat next to me in economy. We talked about the old days, avoiding the tunnel like the plague, both of us knowing that we should pass through it. Although I wondered what would happen if we whistled it on the train going through. Perhaps nothing, because we'd be going so fast. Probably wouldn't even reach the chorus. As we talked about Stella and Charlie's kids, wondering if they'd killed another pet yet, we noticed we were getting closer to the station. It was so peaceful and calm. A loud train horn aired, surprising as it was near the station. Then everything turned chaotic as the train braked suddenly. It was too sudden to be a mere accident. Everybody in the carriage got up as the tannoy relayed. "I do apologise for the abrupt braking, ladies and gentlemen. The driver informs me that there seems to be something on the tracks. As soon as we've cleared it, we'll be moving on to our next stop." Mike looked serious, staring out of the window. We both sensed something. We were stuck there for an hour before finding out they'd found a body. A young man was already knocked down by a train, as though the previous driver had not seen him. Mike wanted to pretend it wasn't Brian, but he knew. He must have. Stella and Charlie worked it out too. They were quiet for most of the time we talked. They'd been at the station. Stella took me aside, telling me that they'd paced it as soon as they'd heard about it. They didn't get a good glimpse at the face because there wasn't much left. However, they had noticed a small amount of shattered red glass to the side of the tunnel. Mike must have worked it out eventually. As Charlie told me, he quit his job and moved home. He was obsessed with the tunnel and claimed he could jump it back in time. He told us you'd been in contact, you see, that you'd left him a note in the box of Rothmans. He bought the local shop's entire stock and chain-smoked them. He disappeared for weeks and come back looking terrible. Stella's very worried about him. I thought I'd contact you. Mike kept going on about you before he went full nuts. I don't know what to do about him. It's not like we can stop the tunnel from being used. However, no one knows about the rule. Even if they did, they wouldn't believe us. It's a belief that only our group has. Perhaps it's got something to do with the fact that the tune was used in the south to smuggle slaves across the train systems. Some sort of dark connection to the past, despite that happening several thousand miles across the Atlantic. If you can reach Mike and calm him down somehow, well, that would be a start. Sorry for the incredibly odd letter. However, I think you might not be surprised. Something about how Mike talked about you suggested you're used to this sort of thing. I hope you can do something. God knows we can't. Yours sincerely, Vivian. That's how the letter ends. Then there's an address, which I won't read out, but also a time, 14:30. The 5th of September, 1992. I don't know what to do with that. I think I'm going to write down any specific times that appear in letters. Maybe I can work out how to time jump there. Yes, with the device, perhaps. Things are really exacerbated recently. That was Letters to Lisa, Recording 5, Compilation 3, The Tunnel. Written by Phoebe Critchlow. Read by Caroline Lawrie.